The Vikings were terrified, not of steel legions or stone castles, but of warriors who turned forests into weapons and made wooden walls drink Viking blood faster than any battlefield in Europe, year 854. Place Apole, a hill fort where Semigallian defenders stood between Viking expansion and Byzantine gold. The odds seemed laughable. A few hundred forest dwellers against the raiders who had conquered from Lindisfarne to the Volga. Within 2 weeks, the Vikings who feared nothing learned to fear the forest. By the end, you'll understand how swamp mazes and hidden traps shattered Viking confidence forever, how a tribe fighting from wooden walls achieved what stone castles couldn't, why this nameless siege changed northern warfare, why no saga dared record what happened in that cursed valley. To understand what scared the Vikings in 854, you must first understand what made them the terror of 3 continents. Because by the time their longships appeared at Apoi, they had spent 70 years teaching Europe the meaning of fear. June 8th, 793. Lindisfarne Monastery, a holy island off the English coast where monks had prayed in peace for generations. The Vikings came with the dawn tide. They killed every monk who couldn't run, burned manuscripts that had survived since Rome fell, threw sacred relics into the sea like common trash. Casualty count: 68 dead, the rest enslaved. The monastery that had stood for 120 years ceased to exist in 4 hours. This wasn't war. This was annihilation as performance art. Consider Paris. In 845, Ragnar Lothbrok, if the man existed, or if the name simply meant every Viking chieftain, brought 120 ships up the Seine. King Charles the Bald paid £7,000 of silver to make them leave. They took the silver and came back 3 more times. By 885, Paris had paid enough ransom to fund a kingdom. Still, the dragon ships returned. The Vikings had discovered something more profitable than conquest, the ransoming of civilization itself. York fell in 866. The Northumbrian capital, defended by stone walls and professional soldiers, lasted 2 days. Population before the assault, 15,000. After, fewer than 3,000 survivors, most sold as slaves to Dublin's markets. The great Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria simply stopped existing. No negotiation, no terms. Just sudden apocalypse followed by new masters who spoke a language the conquered couldn't understand. But here's where it gets insane. Constantinople, the city walls that had held against Persians and Arabs, faced Viking assault in 860. The Rus Eastern Vikings, who had traded longships for riverboats, appeared before the greatest city in Christendom with 200 vessels. They didn't take the city, but they burned everything outside the walls and sailed home rich. The Romans, who had crushed legions, paid tribute to warriors they called barbarians. The mathematics of Viking warfare were brutally simple. Speed plus surprise plus absolute ruthlessness equaled victory against enemies who fought by rules Vikings had never heard of. Their longships were weapons as much as transport. Shallow draft meant they could sail up rivers that proper warships couldn't navigate. 70 feet of oak and iron carrying 30 warriors. Beach the ship, raid a town, be gone before the local lord even heard about the attack. The ships moved like wolves, swift and silent. By the time farmers saw dragon heads on the horizon, their daughters were already roped together in the hold. The secret to Viking dominance wasn't just ships, it was culture weaponized. A society that sent its young men on summer work, the casual term for what their victims called apocalypse. Boys who proved themselves in raids earned land, wives, respect. Those who died went to Valhalla, where they'd feast with Odin. The Vikings had turned afterlife belief into battlefield fearlessness. How do you defeat an enemy who views death as promotion? Their metallurgy gave them edges other armies couldn't match. Pattern-welded blades, folded steel that held edges sharp enough to split shields. Forged by smiths who learned their craft from 3 generations of weapon makers. A Viking sword was an heirloom passed father to son. Each blade named, each one carrying the reputation of every warrior who'd wielded it. When a Viking axe bit through Frankish mail, it wasn't just superior steel. It was the accumulated knowledge of a culture that valued weapon craft above almost everything else. But the real weapon was psychological. The Vikings cultivated terror like farmers tend crops. They didn't just kill, they made killing visible. crucifixions on beaches where trading ships would see them. Blood eagles, the ritual where ribs were torn from spines and lungs pulled out like wings performed on captured nobles where everyone could watch. Torture wasn't cruelty, it was marketing. Every atrocity spread the message: surrender immediately or face horrors your imagination can't encompass. Berserkers were terror given flesh, warriors who worked themselves into battle-trance states, who fought naked or in bearskins, who seemed to feel no pain and showed no fear. Whether the madness came from mushrooms, mead, or genuine religious ecstasy didn't matter to the peasant watching a screaming giant charge through arrow storms without slowing. The Berserker was proof that Vikings weren't quite human, that they'd made pacts with forces civilized people feared to name. By 854, this system had conquered half of Britain, most of Ireland, chunks of Francia. Viking merchants controlled trade routes from Baghdad to Dublin. Their language influenced Anglo-Saxon so deeply that English still carries their words. 3 generations proving that mobility, ruthlessness, and cultural fearlessness could topple any kingdom stupid enough to fight fair, which is why what happened at Apole makes no sense. By every rule of 9th century warfare, a wooden hill fort defended by tribal warriors should have fallen faster than Lindisfarne. The Vikings had crushed stone castles. They'd defeated professional armies. They'd made emperors pay tribute. A few hundred forest people behind timber walls should have been target practice. But the Baltic region was different in ways the Vikings didn't understand until too late. The dense forests of Lithuania and Latvia weren't like anything they'd encountered raiding England or Francia. These were old-growth wilderness where trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground, where the forest floor was a maze of roots and fallen timber that made cavalry impossible and even infantry movement exhausting. The Vikings were ship people. They thought in terms of coastlines and rivers. The forest was someone else's ocean, and they were about to learn they couldn't swim. The tribes who lived there, Semigallians, Curonians, Prussians, Lithuanians, weren't organized into kingdoms with capitals to burn and kings to ransom. They were decentralized clan networks scattered across the wilderness. Each tribe, independent, but allied when threatened. Burn one village, and 10 more remained hidden in the forest. Kill one chief and 5 brothers took his place. The Vikings' standard strategy of striking the head to collapse the body didn't work against enemies who had no head. Just a hydra of clans that regenerated faster than axes could fall. These Baltic warriors fought differently too, not in honorable shield walls where strength and courage decided battles, but in ambushes and traps and guerrilla tactics that made every forest path a potential killing ground. They used the terrain like a weapon, leading raiders into swamps that swallowed horses, into narrow valleys where numbers meant nothing and archery meant everything. The Vikings called it cowardice. The Balts called it survival against invaders who outnumbered them 10 to 1. Most importantly, the Balts built fortresses that violated every principle of siege warfare the Vikings understood. Not stone keeps that could be undermined or battered down, but wooden hill forts constructed on high ground, surrounded by natural obstacles. Rivers, swamps, dense forest. Only one narrow approach path that forced attackers into a fatal funnel. These weren't castles. They were traps disguised as targets. Bait that lured armies into terrain where all their advantages died. Apole was the perfection of this design. A hill rising from swampland, crowned with triple wooden palisades, accessible only by a single causeway barely wide enough for 3 men abreast. The fort sat astride a critical river crossing on the trade route, linking Scandinavia to the eastern markets, where Byzantine gold flowed like water. Control Apoi, and you controlled access to wealth that made Irish plunder look like pocket change. Which is why, in the summer of 854, a Viking fleet carrying 800 warriors arrived at its base to claim what every raid before had proven they could take. The morning air was thick with heat and the buzz of insects. The swamp waters lay dark and still. The wooden walls rose from the hill like teeth. What they found instead was a fortress that had been preparing for this moment since the first dragon ship appeared in Baltic waters. A fortress that didn't just defend, it hunted. The Semigallians who manned Apole's walls weren't the terrified monks of Lindisfarne or the soft merchants of Francia. They were the descendants of warriors who had held this forest since the Romans tried and failed to conquer it. Since the time when legions marched north and simply disappeared into the green darkness, swallowed by terrain that turned every advantage of civilization into a liability. These were forest people, born in the shadow of trees older than Christianity, raised on stories of grandfathers who had killed invaders in the darkness between the pines. Their warfare was older than Viking longships, older than Byzantine tactics. It was the warfare of the hunted who had learned to become hunters, of the outnumbered who had discovered that terrain could multiply fighting power beyond any mathematical logic. They built their fortresses not to withstand siege, but to make siege impossible. Apole sat on a hill 40 feet above the surrounding swampland. The only approach was a causeway of packed earth and timber, barely 10 feet wide, that snaked through marsh that would swallow a horse in minutes. Try to leave the path and the mud claimed you. Stay on it, and you walked into a killing funnel where archers on elevated platforms could loose arrows straight down into shields that protected against horizontal fire, but offered nothing against death falling from above. The walls themselves were engineering that the Vikings had never encountered. Not solid timber that could be burned or battered, but triple palisades separated by earthen berms. Burn the outer wall, and 2 more waited behind it. Ram the first, and the second absorbed the impact. Each wall stood 15 feet high, topped with platforms where defenders could rain arrows, spears, boiling water down on anyone who reached the base. But the real genius was invisible until it killed you. Hidden in the swamp approaches were pit traps covered with vegetation, each one lined with sharpened stakes that had been fire-hardened until they could punch through leather and mail. Scattered along the causeway were trigger mechanisms connected to deadfalls, logs weighing hundreds of pounds suspended in trees, waiting to swing down and crush anyone who stepped wrong. The fortress didn't just defend, it devoured. Conservative estimates placed the garrison at 500 warriors, with another 200 women, children, and elders sheltered inside. Against the 800 Vikings who arrived in late June 854, the numbers seemed hopeless. Every principle of siege warfare said the fort would fall within a week. The Vikings had the numbers, the experience, the reputation that preceded them like a plague. What they didn't have was knowledge of what they were walking into. The Viking commander, unnamed in the fragments of saga that survived, known only as Torrim in later Baltic accounts, was a veteran of the Irish campaigns. He had led raids on Dublin, had burned monasteries across Northumbria, had made Frankish counts pay tribute. This was supposed to be simple. Take the fort, secure the trade route, winter in comfort on Byzantine gold. He brought 800 warriors in 12 longships. Each man carried the standard kit: round shield of linden wood, hand axe or sword, CX knife, maybe a spear. The wealthier warriors wore mail shirts that weighed 30 pounds and had been passed down through families. A few owned helmets of iron or hardened leather. Most fought bareheaded, trusting to speed and fury over protection. They beached their ships 5 miles downriver, out of sight of the fortress. Standard procedure: keep the escape route secure, approach on foot to assess defenses. The morning they arrived, the temperature was already climbing toward what locals would later remember as one of the hottest summers in memory. The air was thick with moisture. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds that made breathing difficult. The Vikings, bred for cold northern waters, began to sweat before they'd even seen the fortress walls. The approach march revealed the first problem. The trail that scouts had reported as adequate turned out to be a nightmare of mud and roots. The forest pressed in from both sides, dense enough that 10 men couldn't march abreast. The canopy overhead blocked most sunlight, creating a green twilight that played tricks on eyes trained for open seas and coastal raids. Vikings were ship people. They thought in terms of horizons and open water. This forest felt like fighting underwater. When they first saw Apole, Torrim reportedly laughed. The scouts who survived later claimed he'd said, "We've burned stone. We'll split this kindling by sunset." The wooden walls looked almost quaint compared to the fortifications they'd faced in Francia and England. No stone, no iron, just timber and earth. The confidence lasted until the first reconnaissance. Torrim sent 20 men forward to probe the defences. Standard procedure: test the walls, draw out defenders, assess their numbers and skill. The scouts moved carefully along the causeway, shields up, eyes scanning for threats. They reached the halfway point without incident. Then the first arrow fell, not from the walls where they expected. From the trees behind them, cut off the retreat before killing the prey. The arrow took a scout through the throat. He fell, choking, drowning in his own blood on dry land. Then the arrows came from the walls. Not the wild volleys of frightened defenders, but precise shots from elevated positions. Shafts that fell almost vertically, punching through shield tops, finding gaps in mail, seeking flesh with mathematical certainty. 12 of the 20 made it back to the main force. 3 died on the causeway. 5 more stepped off the path, trying to find cover, and simply disappeared into the marsh. Their screams as the mud claimed them lasted longer than their comrades wanted to remember. The Vikings who feared nothing had just learned that this forest had teeth. Torgrim's second attempt was more cautious. He sent 100 warriors forward in tight formation, shields overlapped, moving slowly. The causeway forced them into a column barely 5 men wide. As they advanced, defenders on the walls stood silent, watching, waiting. Not a war cry, not a taunt, just 500 sets of eyes, tracking the Viking approach, with the patience of hunters who had done this before. The silence was worse than screaming. The Vikings were used to enemies who met them with noise, with desperate prayers, with defiant challenges. This quiet felt wrong, like walking into a tomb. At 50 yards from the outer wall, the defenders released. Not an arrow storm, but targeted killing. Each archer selected a man, drew, loosed. No wasted shots, no wild volleys. Just methodical death, delivered from positions where return fire meant shooting almost straight up at wooden platforms protected by more timber. 20 Vikings fell in the first 10 seconds. The formation wavered. Shields came up to protect against the vertical fire, but that exposed legs and feet. Arrows found calves, thighs, knees. Men stumbled. The tight formation compressed tighter as warriors tried to maintain protection while advancing. Then the traps sprung. A deadfall swung down from the trees beside the causeway, a log the size of a man's torso travelling at the speed of a galloping horse. It caught 3 warriors and simply erased them. Bone shattered, mail crumpled, the log swung back and forth, now decorated with blood and worse, while the survivors tried to process what had just happened. Torgrim called the retreat. The withdrawal was chaos. Men backed up while maintaining shields overhead, stumbling over bodies, some panicking and running only to trigger more traps or step into the marsh. Of the 100 who had advanced, 73 made it back to the main Viking position. 2 probing attacks, 40 dead, 0 damage to the fortress walls. The mathematics that had always favoured the Vikings were starting to shift. That night, the Baltic defenders launched their own attack. Not an assault, but a haunting. Voices in the darkness calling in Norse, perfect accents, saying the names of men who'd died that day. War horns sounding from different directions, making it impossible to tell how many defenders actually existed. Fires lit in the forest that suggested armies moving through the darkness. None of it real, all of it effective. By dawn, the Vikings who had made kings tremble were exhausted from a night of jumping at shadows. Some muttered about forest spirits, about curses, about gods who didn't recognize Odin's authority in these ancient woods. Torgrim moved through the camp, trying to restore confidence, but even he couldn't explain how defenders behind wooden walls were making his warriors afraid of empty forest. On the 3rd day, he tried fire. If the walls were wood, burn them. Simple, brutal, effective everywhere else they'd tried it. 20 men advanced with bundles of oil-soaked rags tied to arrows. They reached arrow range, lit the bundles, loosed toward the walls. The defenders had soaked their palisades days before. The fire arrows struck wood and sputtered. Some caught briefly, small flames that the defenders extinguished with water, kept in leather buckets on every platform. Within minutes, every fire arrow had died. The Vikings had wasted resources and gained nothing but the knowledge that even this simple tactic wouldn't work here. By day 5, frustration had become rage. The Vikings, who had never failed, were failing against an enemy they could see but couldn't touch. Warriors began arguing. Some wanted to abandon the siege, to find easier targets downriver. Others insisted honor demanded they take the fort or die trying. Torrim made his decision. No more probing, no more caution. They would assault the walls with everything they had and break through by sheer weight of numbers and Nordic fury. What he didn't know was that the defenders had been counting on exactly this decision, that every failed probe had been teaching the Semigallians which tactics worked best. That patience was its own weapon when facing an enemy whose culture demanded quick victory or glorious death. The morning of day 6 dawned hot and still. The swamp stank of rot and death. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick they formed visible clouds. And 600 Vikings, leaving 200 to guard the ships, prepared for the assault that would either take the fortress or destroy them trying. On the walls above, 500 defenders checked their arrows, tested their bowstrings, and waited for the mathematics of desperation to deliver the enemy straight into the trap they'd spent generations perfecting. The assault began at dawn with the sound Torrim hoped would break defender morale. 600 Vikings beating axes against shields, a thunder that had preceded the fall of monasteries and kingdoms. The rhythm that announced apocalypse was coming, and nothing could stop it. They roared their war cries, called on Odin and Thor, promised the defenders quick deaths if they surrendered now. The Semigallians responded with silence. Complete, absolute, 600 men screaming and 500 defenders standing motionless as carved stone. The only movement was the slow adjustment of bow arms tracking targets. The only sound from the walls was wind through timber. It was unnerving in its simplicity. Every enemy the Vikings had faced met them with noise, desperate prayers, defiant challenges, battle cries meant to convince themselves they could win. But these forest warriors stood in silence that seemed to swallow sound itself, like the fortress was holding its breath, waiting. The first wave hit the causeway at a run. 200 warriors, shields raised, moving fast to minimize time under the arrows. The killing ground claimed them immediately. Defenders on 3 levels of walls released in coordinated volleys, not firing at will but in disciplined waves that created continuous arrow fall. As soon as one rank loosed, they stepped back to knock fresh shafts while the second rank released. The arrows fell like winter sleet, each shaft seeking flesh with the precision of hunters who had practiced this exact scenario since childhood. Vikings fell, not in dramatic death scenes but in the ugly arithmetic of archery warfare. An arrow through a thigh that sent a man sprawling, another warrior tripping over him, 3 more stumbling into the pile-up, a shaft finding the gap between helmet and mail, dropping a man instantly, his neighbor pausing to check if he lived, taking an arrow in the shoulder for his loyalty. The causeway became a chaos of falling bodies and warriors trying to maintain formation while death rained from 3 directions. Those who reached the base of the outer wall found temporary shelter. The angle was too steep for defenders directly above to shoot straight down. For a moment, the survivors caught their breath. Then the boiling water came. Leather buckets heated over fires behind the walls. Defenders poured them over the edge onto warriors pressed against the timber. The screams were immediate. Mail heated to burning. Skin boiled beneath. Men stumbled backward into the arrow fire, trying to escape the scalding, only to take shafts through the gaps in their panicked defense. Of the 200 who charged, perhaps 140 made it back to the Viking lines, not running, backing up slowly, shields raised, dragging wounded, maintaining what discipline they could. But the math was brutal. 60 casualties, 0 damage to the walls, not even a mark on the timber. Torrim watched his warriors retreat and felt the first cold finger of real doubt. But he was Viking. He had reputation to maintain, honor that demanded victory. He ordered the second wave immediately. No pause for the defenders to rest. Keep the pressure constant. Wear them down through sheer, relentless assault. 300 warriors this time, half his remaining force. They charged while the first wave's bodies still lay cooling on the causeway. The same killing ground, the same arrow storm, the same mathematics of death versus distance. But this wave brought something new. 20 berserkers who had worked themselves into battle trance with mushrooms, mead, and muttered prayers to the old gods, men who felt no pain, who viewed death as passage to Valhalla, who charged bare-chested through arrow storms that would make normal warriors flinch. The Berserkers led the assault. They absorbed arrows that would have killed ordinary men and kept coming. One took 3 shafts through the chest and still reached the wall. He planted a scaling ladder against the timber, began climbing even as blood poured from his wounds. 2 defenders above shot him 4 more times. He climbed 3 more rungs before finally falling backward, crashing into warriors below. The madness was contagious in the worst way. It made other Vikings abandon caution. If the Berserkers could charge through death, so could they. Warriors broke formation to follow their champions. They ran directly into the traps that patience would have avoided. A pit trap collapsed under a cluster of warriors. 4 men fell onto sharpened stakes that punched through mail and flesh. Their screams were wet. Final, the warriors behind them paused, looking down at their friends impaled like meat on spits. That pause cost them. Arrows found the stationary targets. Then a deadfall swung from the forest edge. The log caught 6 men and broke them, not killed cleanly but crushed. Ribs shattered. Spines snapped. Men left alive but destroyed, their bodies bent into shapes that shouldn't exist. The assault collapsed into chaos. Some warriors pressed forward toward the walls. Others froze, overwhelmed by the carnage. A few broke and ran, honor be damned, survival instinct finally overriding cultural conditioning. Young Bjorn, barely 18 winters, on his first raid, promised glory and gold by his father, who had died at York, found himself face to face with death falling from above. An arrow took him through the shoulder. Not fatal but agonizing, he stumbled, fell to his knees on the causeway. Another shaft missed his head by inches. He looked up at the walls, at the defenders calmly knocking fresh arrows, and understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't a battle. It was an execution. He crawled backward, dragging himself with one good arm while his shoulder poured blood. A warrior he didn't know grabbed him, hauled him up, half carried him back to the Viking lines. Bjorn survived. The man who saved him took an arrow through the eye during the retreat and died without ever learning the name of the boy he'd rescued. Of the 300 who attacked in the second wave, fewer than 200 made it back. The causeway was now carpeted with bodies. The Vikings had lost over 200 warriors in 2 hours of combat. They hadn't touched the fortress walls, hadn't killed a single defender that anyone could confirm. The mathematics that had always favored them were now a nightmare equation. They were bleeding to death against an enemy who stood untouchable behind timber. Here's where it gets worse. The heat of late morning turned the battlefield into hell itself. The bodies on the causeway began to rot in the sun. The smell mixed with swamp stench created an atmosphere that made breathing difficult. Flies swarmed in clouds so thick they covered the dead. Some of the wounded left on the causeway, too injured to crawl back, too exposed for rescue, begged their comrades to finish them. A few Vikings tried. The defenders shot them for their mercy. Torrim held council with his surviving commanders. The situation was impossible. They couldn't advance without horrific casualties. They couldn't retreat without admitting defeat that would follow them across every Viking settlement from Iceland to the Volga. They couldn't wait because supplies were limited and the defenders showed no sign of weakening. One commander suggested starvation siege. Surround the fort, wait them out. Another pointed out the obvious. They were in hostile territory, deep in forest where the semi-galleons knew every path. The defenders probably had supply routes through the swamp that Vikings couldn't follow. Who would starve first? Night fell on day 6. The Vikings built fires and posted double guards. They expected another psychological assault like the first night. What came instead was worse. Around midnight, a single defender appeared on the walls, lit by torches so every Viking could see clearly. He wasn't armed, he was just standing there, looking down at the Viking camp with something that might have been pity. Then he spoke in perfect Norse. Your dead are rotting. The crows will feast tomorrow. You can join them on the causeway or you can leave while you still can. We will remember you either way. Then he disappeared back into the fortress. The message was clear. You're not conquering us. We're letting you die here. The choice is yours. Some Vikings muttered about sorcery. How did forest barbarians speak Norse like they'd been raised in Norway? Others didn't care about the mechanism. They just knew that the confidence they'd felt 6 days ago had evaporated into the stinking marsh air. Day 7. Torgrim made his final decision. One more assault. Everything they had. If this failed, they'd retreat and face the shame. But at least they'd tried. At least they'd honored the warrior code that demanded you die fighting rather than flee. 400 warriors formed up. Every man who could still hold a weapon. The wounded who could walk insisted on joining. Better to die in the assault than survive in disgrace. They left only the ship guards behind. This was the moment that would define them. Heroes or cowards. Saga-worthy or forgotten. The final charge began just after dawn. 400 Vikings compressed onto a causeway designed for 3 men abreast. They had to climb over their own dead from previous assaults. Bodies had swollen in the heat, burst, leaked fluids that made footing treacherous. The smell was apocalyptic. But the Vikings came on, because this was who they were. Warriors who died standing rather than live kneeling. The defenders released every arrow they'd been saving. The volleys came so fast they overlapped. The air itself seemed made of wood and iron. Shafts punched through shields, through mail, through flesh and bone. Vikings fell in clusters, tripped over bodies, stumbled into traps that had been reset during the night. But this time, the sheer weight of numbers carried some warriors to the wall. 30, maybe 40, made it to the base. They planted ladders, began climbing. Finally they'd reach the defenders and end this with steel and fury at close range where archery meant nothing. The first Viking to reach the wall top was named Gunnar, veteran of 20 raids, killer of men in 4 countries. He cleared the rampart, saw defenders up close for the first time. They weren't the terrified primitives he'd imagined. They were calm, professional, already drawing the long knives they'd use when bows became impractical. Gunnar lasted 5 seconds. A semi-Gallian warrior, later named in Baltic accounts as Daumantas, called the Bear, for reasons that became immediately apparent, met him with an axe that might have been forged by the same gods who made Gunnar's weapon. The 2 blades met. Daumantas was bigger, fresher, fighting from stable ground while Gunnar balanced on a ladder. The axe came down. Gunnar's skull split. He fell backward off the ladder, crashed into warriors climbing behind him. 3 men fell in a tangle of limbs and metal. But more Vikings reached the top. For 10 minutes that felt like hours, hand-to-hand combat raged on the ramparts. Vikings, who had terrorized Europe, met forest warriors who had never known defeat on their own ground. Axes rang against axes. Men grappled and fell. Blood made the wooden platforms slick. The defenders held. Not easily, not without loss. 3 semi-Gallians died in the rampart fighting, the first confirmed defender casualties of the entire siege, but they gave ground in meters, not in breakthrough. And behind them, fresh warriors rotated in while exhausted. Vikings had nowhere to rotate to. Just more desperate climbing, more dying on ladders, more bodies falling. Then the moment that broke Viking will entirely. Torgrim himself, ashamed to lead from safety, climbed a ladder to join the rampart fighting. He was a skilled warrior, experienced, strong. He cleared the wall, engaged Daumantas directly in single combat that both sides stopped to watch. They traded blows. Torgrim's sword against Daumantas' axe. The Viking commander was faster. But the semi-Gallian was fresh, while Torgrim had been leading assaults for 7 days with little sleep and less food. The exhaustion showed. Torgrim's strikes slowed. His defense lagged. Daumantas' axe found the gap between helmet and shoulder. Not a clean kill, a terrible wound that opened Torgrim's neck and shoulder in a spray of arterial blood. The Viking commander fell on the rampart, drowning in his own blood, watching the sky fade above him. His last word was reportedly a name, his wife's, or his daughter's, or perhaps just a sound that meant he'd finally realized glory wasn't worth this price. The Vikings on the wall saw their leader fall and something inside them broke. Not courage, not skill, just the belief that they could win this. They'd lost too many, bled too much, died too pointlessly against an enemy who kept standing no matter how many times they charged. The withdrawal began, not routed, not fleeing in panic, but backing down ladders, pulling off the wall, reforming at the causeway's base. The retreat was orderly, disciplined, professional. The defenders let them go, conserving arrows, content to watch their enemies finally accept reality. Of the 400 who made the final assault, 247 made it back to the camp, 153 dead, including their commander, for a handful of defender casualties and no meaningful damage to the fortress. The Vikings, who had never fled from anything, prepared to do what shame demanded they never do. They prepared to leave a battlefield without victory. The survivors gathered what they could carry and abandoned what they couldn't. Armor too damaged to repair, weapons too heavy for exhausted men. The wounded who couldn't walk faced a choice no warrior should face: crawl after the column or accept mercy from the forest. Most chose the blade. Their brothers wept as they delivered it. The retreat began at midday on the 8th day, 247 warriors from the original 800, walking wounded who should have been carried but had to stumble on their own because there weren't enough whole men to bear them. They moved slowly, shields still raised against possible pursuit, eyes scanning the forest that had become more terrifying than any army they'd faced. The defenders didn't pursue. They stood on their walls watching the Vikings disappear into the trees, silent as they'd been throughout. No victory cries, no celebration. Just the quiet of warriors who had done exactly what they'd trained for and saw no reason to gloat about survival. But they did one thing that would echo through history. They gathered the Viking dead from the causeway, over 200 bodies bloating in the heat. And instead of defiling them, instead of the mockery that defeated invaders usually received, they built funeral pyres, burned the bodies with honor, sent the ashes downriver where the Vikings would find them. The message was clear: we didn't hate you. We just refused to die for you. Young Bjorn, still bleeding from his shoulder wound, watched smoke from those fires rise above the trees as the column limped toward their ships. He would survive the journey home, would live another 40 years. Would tell the story of Apoi exactly once, to his grandson, and then never speak of it again. Some victories haunt, some defeats teach. This one did both. The Vikings reached their ships 3 days later. 12 longships that had carried 800 confident warriors now loaded 247 broken survivors. They sailed north with empty benches and knowledge that would change Viking strategy for a generation. Here's what your history teacher never told you. The siege of Apole lasted 8 days. Conservative estimates place Viking casualties at 553 dead with hundreds more wounded. Defender losses: fewer than 20 confirmed dead, perhaps 50 wounded. The exchange rate was catastrophic. For every defender who fell, nearly 30 Vikings died. But the real casualty was mythology. The Vikings who had burned their way across Europe learned that some ground costs more blood than it's worth. That terrain can multiply defensive power beyond any numerical advantage. That mobility means nothing when geography forces you into killing funnels designed by defenders who've had centuries to perfect the art of making invasion impossible. The strategic consequences were immediate. Word of the defeat spread through Viking networks faster than ships could sail. Within months, every raider from Norway to Iceland knew: avoid the Baltic fortresses. The easy gold is elsewhere. The forest forts eat armies. Viking expansion into the eastern Baltics slowed to a crawl. The trade routes they'd sought remained in Semigalian control for another generation. The path to Byzantine wealth stayed closed, forcing Vikings to find alternative routes that cost more time and resources. What should have been a quick conquest of a backwater region became a generations-long stalemate that the Vikings never truly won. But wait, it gets worse for Norse reputation. The sagas that recorded every Viking victory from Dublin to Constantinople maintained complete silence about Apole. No skalds sang of the brave warriors who fought there. No poems honored the fallen. In the vast chronicle of Viking conquests, this defeat simply doesn't exist in Norse sources. The only records come from Baltic chronicles written centuries later, and archaeological evidence that confirms what pride couldn't admit. Modern excavations at the Apoi site reveal mass graves from the mid-9th century. Scandinavian weapons and armor found scattered in the swamp approaches, burn layers from funeral pyres, and the fortress walls themselves, rebuilt multiple times over centuries, but standing essentially intact through the period when Vikings should have swept them aside like kindling. The Semigalians remembered. They recorded the siege in oral traditions passed through generations. They built monuments to Daumantus and the defenders who proved that forest people could stand against the North's finest. The victory strengthened Baltic tribal confederations, demonstrating that coordinated defense using terrain advantages could defeat enemies who seemed unstoppable in open battle. The tactical lessons spread beyond the Baltic. Other tribes studied Apole's success. The strategy of hill forts with single approach paths, of using swamps and forests as force multipliers, of patient defensive warfare that made attackers bleed for every inch, these became standard practice throughout the region. The Vikings adapted or avoided. Mostly they avoided. History pivoted on this nameless siege in ways that ripple even today. Military historians study Apole as a textbook example of defensive warfare. How to use geography as a weapon. How to make assault so costly that even victory would feel like defeat. Special Forces training programs reference the Semigallian tactics, create kill zones, control approach paths, make the enemy come to you where all their advantages die. The parallels to other impossible defenses are striking. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held a narrow pass against the Persian Empire. Rorke's Drift, where 150 British soldiers defended a mission station against 4,000 Zulu warriors. The Chosin Reservoir, where surrounded Marines fought their way through overwhelming Chinese forces. Again and again, history proves that terrain plus determination can multiply combat power beyond mathematical logic. But Apole adds something those other battles lack. The Vikings weren't just defeated, they were psychologically broken. They didn't retreat to regroup and try again. They left and never came back. The fortress that should have fallen in days stood for centuries after. The trade routes it controlled remained in Baltic hands. The warriors who defended it became legends in their own culture while vanishing entirely from the sagas of the invaders. You think courage is charging into battle with sword and shield. That's one kind. The other kind is standing on a wooden wall, watching an army that's never lost march toward you, knowing they outnumber you, knowing their reputation, knowing that if the walls fall, everyone you love dies, and standing anyway, drawing your bow anyway, trusting that the ground beneath you and the knowledge passed from your grandfathers will be enough. That's the courage that changes history, not the loud kind that makes for good stories, the quiet kind that makes invaders turn around. The smoke from the funeral pyres dissipated into the summer sky. It carried more than the souls of dead Vikings. It carried a message that would haunt every Norse commander who heard the tale. In that swamp-ringed fortress, the unstoppable force met the immovable object, and for once, the object didn't just hold, it won. The golden age of Viking expansion continued for another 2 centuries. They conquered England, colonized Iceland and Greenland, reached North America, established kingdoms that lasted generations. But when they planned their raids, when they charted their courses, when they decided which targets were worth the blood, they remembered the forest. They remembered the fortress that swallowed 800 warriors and gave back 247 broken survivors. They remembered Apoi, and they sailed elsewhere. Archaeological evidence, found in recent decades, confirms what Baltic tradition always maintained. The fortress stood essentially unchanged until the 13th century, when the Teutonic Knights finally brought enough siege equipment and manpower to reduce it through engineering rather than assault. Even then, it took months. The walls that Vikings couldn't breach required medieval siege technology to crack. The last Semigallian defenders of Apole finally fell not to raiders, but to the systematic conquest of organized crusade. But they'd held their ground for 400 years after the Vikings learned their lesson. 4 centuries during which the forest remained unconquered. 4 centuries during which that single siege echoed through northern warfare as proof that some ground costs more than glory can pay. Today, the site is a grassy hill overlooking marshland that's been partially drained by modern agriculture. Archaeological markers show where the walls once stood. Information plaques tell sanitized versions of the battle. Tourists visit in summer, take pictures, leave without fully grasping what happened here. But if you stand on that hill at dawn, when the mist rises from the remaining swamp and the forest presses close, you can almost hear it. The silence of 500 defenders, watching 800 raiders march to their doom, the whistle of arrows falling like winter sleet, the screams of men drowning in mud, the crash of deadfalls swinging through morning air. And beneath it all, the quiet certainty of warriors who knew their ground, trusted their strategy, and refused to yield even when mathematics said they should. The Vikings taught Europe to fear the dragon ships. The Semigalians taught the Vikings to fear the forest. In that exchange, empires learned what defenders of impossible ground have always known. Terrain doesn't care about reputation. Geography doesn't bow to glory. And sometimes, the side that refuses to move defeats the side that can't stop moving. The fortress stood. The Vikings fled, and in the silence after battle, you could hear the sound of inevitability learning it had limits. They came as conquerors who had never known defeat. They left as storytellers of a lesson too shameful to record. In that forest, time moved sideways to an age when ground itself could fight back, when wooden walls proved stronger than steel confidence, when 500 made 800 understand that some victories cost more than any defeat. The last Viking ship disappeared downriver. The defenders returned to their lives. And in the quiet that followed, the forest resumed its patient watch over ground that had drunk deeply of northern blood and would remember the taste for centuries.